Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Well, thanks for coming. Really appreciate it. Tony's going above and beyond the Call of Duty here, bringing all this stuff in. He's going to tell us about finishing the hat. I hope you have a chance to go to Cohoes Music Hall this season. The first two productions were excellent. I have to say Hairspray was really good, though. I mean, Christmas Carol was good, too, but Hairspray, and they still have coming up Forever Plaid and the replay, Crazy Few and Cabaret, unless there's a touring company of Cabaret coming around. I don't know. So it sounds like you all know Tony, so here he comes. He's going to talk about the Stephen Sondheim book, Finishing the Hat.
Thanks, Joe. Good afternoon, everyone. Not used to using a microphone at the Cohoes Music Hall, but we'll use it for here today. First of all, thank you, Joe, for having me back. This is my second talk here, yeah, you know, I'm so fortunate that I'm able to speak and share about a huge passion of mine, which is theater, something I know a little bit about, but I'm constantly learning. And what inspires me here at the Colonie Town Library is to read a little bit more. Not just the scripts or the grants that we write or the sponsorship proposals, but to delve into lyricists and composers and writers and playwrights and screenwriters. It's so interesting. I love the background stories, and I love the making of, and Finishing the Hat is an incredible book that tells you so much about the early years of Stephen Sondheim's works. And he finishes this book with a wonderful line about meeting the next phase and partner in his career, James Lapine, and he finishes with intermission. So I look forward to reading, finishing the cloak, I don't know, finishing the hat. Let me start off by letting you all know my history with Stephen Sondheim. I started my world of theater very late in my collegiate career, and Into the Woods was the third musical I ever saw. And it was only because of a friend that was in the show and persuaded me to go. And when I read a little bit about the premise about the theater piece, I was a little bit intrigued. It takes all of the Grimm fairy tales and throws them into one incredible interwoven story. And it answers the question, what happens after Ever After? What happens after Cinderella finds Prince Charming and Jack climbs the beanstalk and Little Red beats the wolf? And I was incredibly intrigued, loved the story, but mostly I quite didn't understand why I was so moved and riveted by it. And when I learned a little bit more about the lyricist and the composer being the same person, it just made so much sense. It made so much more sense that I went back and I saw the same production 4 more times. And that's how much detail and that's how much richness and subtext there is in all of Stephen Sondheim's work. So reading this and understanding his approach to his work was incredibly interesting to me. He has these principles that he follows. One being content dictates form, less is more, and God is in the details. And that's so true. And I think it's so true just in life, but so much in just the simplicity and the clarity of his work and of theater in general. And that's what he does. He does all of that in the service of clarity. And I'm now currently directing Into the Woods at the Cohoes Music Hall. And I directed it last year as well at Siena College. So you can tell there's this thing I have for Into the Woods. But it's more about Stephen Sondheim. And I use his principles in my directing, and I use that in just the simplicity, following what this playwright, lyricist, and composer are telling us to do. Let me tell you a little bit more about Stephen Sondheim, the person. First of all, I printed up all of his awards and accolades, and it's about 4 pages long. So I'll just generally tell you, the man has an Oscar, he has various Grammy awards, and the most Tony Awards ever awarded to a composer or lyricist. The Kennedy Center has also honored him with a Lifetime Achievement Award. The man also has a Pulitzer Prize in Drama for Sunday in the Park with George. And like I said, an Academy Award for Sooner or Later, which was a song from a 1990 film, Dick Tracy, that Madonna sang. So needless to say, Stephen Sondheim has an incredible trophy case at home. Born in 1930, March 22nd, he grew up in the Upper West Side of New York, and so much of his plays and stories are about New York, or that's sort of the catalyst and where he started a lot of his stories. Born to a Jewish family, but family to him really didn't come in form of relatives, but in collaborations in all of his shows. Wasn't very close to his mother, wasn't very close to his father. I think a friend of theirs in this book I learned, gave him a birthday gift, and on it was a plate. It was actually an uncle of his, was a plate, and he said, "Where is Delsey's head?" Delsey's his mom. I guess he wanted her head on a plate for that birthday gift. So they weren't very, very close, but he did find that his collaborators and people he worked with became his family, albeit for a short time, working on a project, working on a particular show, conceiving of a production. They were his family nonetheless. So this book, Finishing the Hat, he starts off by saying it's a book, well, it's a contradiction in terms. Theater lyrics are not written to be read, but to be sung, and sung as parts of a larger structure. For example, a musical comedy piece, a musical play, a review, and so almost all of the lyrics in this book were written not just to be sung, but to be sung in particular musicals by individuals, by characters, to help keep the story moving and keep the audience intrigued. For example, Oscar Hammerstein is one of his, well, is his mentor and his guide, and he met him when he was 11, and Oscar took him under his wing. But he brings an example into this. If I just read this, "Oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh, what a beautiful day. I got a beautiful feeling. Everything's going my way." We all know what that's from, correct? Let me play that for you.
There's a bright golden haze on the meadow. There's a bright golden haze on the meadow. The corn is as high as an elephant's high, and it looks like it's climbing clear up to the sky. Oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh, what a beautiful day. I got a beautiful feeling.
So you see how the music is supporting that feeling. What you, just by saying, "Oh, what a beautiful morning," doesn't do it justice in reading it or just hearing it. Having the partnership of the music, having the understanding of the swellness of the music, and then understanding exactly what this character is speaking of, really makes it brings it home for us. So he struggles in all of his work. Testified in this book, lyrics versus poetry. Lyrics, even the poetic ones, are not poems. Poems are written to be read silently, aloud, but not sung. And when we read poetry, we create its own tempo, its own rhythm. We punctuate those words that might mean a little bit more to us or that we're connected with. But in lyrics, it's all dictated by the composer and the lyricists, and of course, later on, the director and performers. So he's often been challenged, poetry versus lyrics. And I always wonder why people write books, what inspires them, what makes them feel that they can offer a little bit more insight. And reading this passage about why he wrote this book about lyrics, he wrote especially theater lyrics, which are a fringe enthusiasm at best, considering their tiny impact of what is currently coming out of people's earphones or the bar down the block or the car blasting by you. The lyrics of contemporary popular songs of rock and rap and country are the ones which reflect the immediacy of our world, much as theater songs did in the half century of the 20th century, the earlier half. They are the socialists' totems. They study them, and they result in an abundance of essays and books, and not to mention college courses. Live theater itself is most an ancillary part of American culture these days. Ever since the advent of movies and televisions, theater going has increasingly become either a dutiful activity for a dwindling, aging audience or an occasional festive night out. As a theater producer, I hate to read this. So it's the purchase of a hard-to-get theater ticket that is the greatest pleasure for so many of theater goers now. For example, I heard a gentleman mention Spider-Man, and I thought, whoa, did you see Spider-Man? I'm really curious about it, you know? Am I curious because of all of the publicity that it's getting, and is it all positive? I haven't heard one thing about the music, the lyrics, the staging. Well, yes, we've heard about the staging. But he goes on to mention that Broadway theater, formerly the font of new American plays, has for many years been focused predominantly on musicals, chiefly two kinds: the stolid, solemn uplift equipped with impressive lumbering spectacle, and elaborate concerts of familiar pop songs threaded along a storyline. And also the remake of movies. Stephen Sondheim right now is thinking that the American musical theater is lacking in its creativity, lacking in its spontaneity, lacking in its genius to bring about a commonplace and ordinary theme and glamorizing that. Obviously, he hopes it does increase in his, he's now 80 years old, and hopes that in 10, 15 years there's a turnaround so he can write his next big hit. But he happily says that schools still persist in putting on plays. Performing live theater still seems to be fun for young people. And nevertheless, rock concerts at their theater of choice, and even the territorial, is succumbing in popularity to more passive forms: movies, televisions, and the internet. He used to think that live theater would never die, but he fears that he may be a little wrong. So he wrote this book because he found that it's a great way to talk about his collections or his earlier collections, and he also says that he was sort of prompted to do this by a publisher, but he wanted to support his comments on the craft that he knew and dealt a lot about. For a good 63 years, he worked on his craft. But for example, he talks about those that can appreciate theater, those that can appreciate the lyrics of his songs, and he parallels it with an anecdote that he doesn't cook, nor does he want to, but he reads cooking columns with intensity and implicit interest. The technical details echo those of which challenge a songwriter: timing, balance, form, surface versus substance, and all of the rest of it. They resonate for him even though he has no desire to braise, to parboil, or to saute. So neither do you. So similarly, he hopes the specific techniques of lyric writing will enlighten the cook who reads these pages. Choices, decisions, and mistakes in every attempt to make something that wasn't there before are essentially the same, and exploring one set of them, he likes to believe, may cast light on another. So let's start delving into one of his pieces, one that I have a strong connection with, West Side Story. This was Stephen Sondheim's first Broadway adventure, and he was the lyricist for it. He always wanted to come into this field as a composer, and almost declined his position on this production because he thought he would be pigeonholed as just a lyricist. But he was prompted by his mentor, Oscar Hammerstein, to, as he said, take the gig. You're a young kid. You can compose later on in your life. But what Stephen Sondheim thinks of West Side is, for most people, West Side Story is about racial prejudice and urban violence. But what it's really about is musical theater. And to be more precise, it's about the blending of a book, music, lyrics, and most important, dance into a seamless telling of a story. What Agnes DeMille and Oscar Hammerstein did with Oklahoma was revolutionary in the world of theater. No other production before that really gave characters a true life, really gave you an emotional connection to these characters, and made every word that they said that important. Before then, theater was still moving from this vaudevillian, comedic spectacle. Oklahoma was the first one that really told a story. Not just that, but Agnes DeMille transformed the world of dance and with her Dream Ballet, a 12-minute dance sequence. Obviously, there was no speaking. It was just beautiful music, but there were stories told through dance, which inspired Stephen Sondheim to jump on board with West Side Story. So he realized that dance was an essential part of a commercial theater instead of the traditional function as diversion or ornamentation, which I think we see a lot of that today in our own musical theater. So the privilege that Agnes DeMille brought to her choreography and that Jerome Robbins would bring to West Side Story, it really, really inspired him to work on this project. He also learned that West Side Story was quintessentially a lesson in collaboration. Collaboration with Bernstein, Arthur Lawrence, Jerome Robbins. Well, he says Jerome Robbins was a whole other matter, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Yes, and so he spoke that he felt that the first time writing lyrics to someone else's music, to someone else that was a legend and verging on a myth, really, and whose score on the town would be a true gift and he can learn from. And because of this show, he and Bernstein worked on many more productions after this. So his audition, he actually had to go into Bernstein's apartment to audition, and he brought in some music of his from a play that he wrote called Saturday Night. And he, well, actually they were looking for someone to just be the lyric writer because they had somebody else in mind, two people, Betty Comden and Adolph Green, who were supposed to supply the lyrics, but they were mixed in the movie and weren't quite sure. So as a possible choice, they thought, let's try this kid, Stephen Sondheim, out and see if he could do it. He went into audition, playing some of his tunes, and he was asked, do you have anything else? Do you have any songs that were a little bit more poetic? He indeed did have many of those songs from his earlier days, but was not courageous enough to perform in front of him, and so decided to say no. With that, he sort of shrugged at him and said, all right, kid, maybe I'll call you back in a week, and we'll see if the other two are not available, perhaps you can jump on board and be our lyricist. So he left that day thinking, I really wanted to be invited to the party, but I didn't really want to go. He did get a call the next week and told Leonard Bernstein that he wasn't sure. He'd have to call him back. Quickly got on the phone and spoke with Oscar Hammerstein, and Oscar said, hang up the phone right now and call and say yes. And beautiful he did, and there began his first steps into being part of his first Broadway show. He did, however, have two regrets. One was that he was afraid that it would tag and then dodged him and label him as a lyricist, so that when his music finally popped into the open, people would dismiss him as some overly ambitious pretender who should just stick to his own side of the street, which was lyrics, not composition. His other regret was that many of the lyrics in West Side Story suffer from a self-conscious effort to be what Leonard Bernstein deemed poetic. He had originally been hired to be a co-lyricist with him, and he knew that from the start it was going to be a collaboration with someone whose ideas of poetic lyric writing was the antithesis of his own. But again, chiming in, speaking to his mentor, Oscar, he had given him such confidence that his naivete thought he could prevail and he could stand up to the likes of Arthur Lawrence, and Leonard Bernstein, and Jerome Robbins. Speaking of his collaboration with Leonard Bernstein, he learned to approach theater music in general, more freely and less squarely. Now, if you know of anything about Stephen Sondheim's works, it doesn't matter the measure of music or how many bars should be in. I've seen so many performers almost have mental breakdowns trying to learn his music. The syncopation of it is truly, truly incredible. And you think, he must have failed in math somewhere, because it makes no sense. Yet, the more you dive into it, the more you really think about the man's subtext and story, it sort of does make sense. You just have to have a trained ear or hundreds of hours of rehearsal, which we're doing with our kids right now in Into the Woods. And they're geniuses, really. They're really great in math. The collaboration with Jerome Robbins was difficult because, well, Stephen Sondheim fell victim of his vicious attacks. Jerome Robbins is known, has this reputation of not being a very friendly person. And there's a story I've heard that Jerome Robbins pushed a dancer off stage once because he was too far downstage or close to the orchestra pit. And he kept repeating and repeating and saying, "You're too far, you're going to fall. You're going to fall into the pit." That same dancer was a little too close, and he walked up to him and pushed him. He said, "I told you." So that was sort of the collaboration that his idea that he had to work with in Jerome Robbins. But a month before rehearsals were supposed to begin, Cheryl Crawford, who had held the option for the show to be the show's producer, decided that she wasn't really interested in producing the show anymore, and that the script hadn't sufficiently explored the causes of juvenile delinquency. So they left her office after doing all of this work, he and Arthur Lawrence, and well, as he said, stunned and discouraged, they left Shirley's office to regroup over a drink at the nearest watering hole, which turned out to be the cocktail lounge at the legendary theatrical Algonquin Hotel, only to suffer another blow because the management refused entry because Arthur Lawrence wasn't wearing a tie. So even more discouraged, they moved to the hotel next door, the Iroquois, which was far less fancy, and were permitted to enter. And Arthur Lawrence proceeded to pick up the phone and call his friend Roger Stevens, who was in Europe touring another show, and spoke to him about producing the show, or trying to help Cheryl Crawford to believe that this was a viable production. Again, discouraged, and if the gentleman mentioned, if Cheryl says no, then I have to say no. So dejected, he walked into his apartment, and as he says, gloomily, I trudged home, certain that my Broadway debut was now postponed indefinitely. So no sooner had he entered his apartment that the phone rang, and it was his good friend and successful producer, Harold Prince, who called. And as Stephen Sondheim says, as a good friend, I listened to Harold because he was complaining about a production that he was currently in and producing, and just relating to a friend. And as Stephen Sondheim says, as a good friend, I sat and I listened and listened and listened. Then when he was done, I started to tell him about my woes, about West Side Story. And as Harold Prince said, he sounded so inspired, invigorated by this conversation that he said, all right, kid, why don't you send me a script and I'll take a look at it and see if we enjoy it. 24 hours later, he called, Harold Prince called Stephen Sondheim and said, we're on the next train, we'll be there, we want to do this play. And there he had a producer. So West Side Story did have a possibility, and being produced, which obviously it was, or at least rehearsals were about to begin. He mentions again about collaborations, and most of all what he learned from the collaboration on West Side Story is how much you need a collaborator. Even if he were a skilled playwright and he wouldn't write down his own librettos. He has to work with someone who can help him out writing holes or figuring out ways of getting out of traps, and to feed him suggestions when invention flags, and someone he needs to help in the collaboration to be part of a family. And working mostly with absent parents as a child, he grew up with any sense of family. So every new show provided him with a new one. It may be a temporary family, but it always gave him a solid sense of belonging to someone outside of himself. So with his dysfunctional family together for West Side Story, the challenge for Arthur Lawrence and for he were to find a language for the Jets. Now, originally, West Side Story was to be Polish versus Jewish. It was not the Puerto Rican versus just a general wash of Polish, Irish mix. But knowing that, they were looking for slang and looking for a way that the average musical could be written but still brought to life and was contemporary enough. So what they came up with was a hybrid of slang, a mixture of tough and naive, of both inventive and actual jargon. Things like fracka-dracka-track, or frabba-jabba, or rig-a-ting-ting-tum, intertwined with jazz-inflected words like cool and daddy-o, alongside the expressions of gang loyalty like womb to tomb, sperm to worm. And the style may now seem quaint, especially in light of opera and frequent use of four-letter words on stage today, but it only occasionally sounds dated. For example, words cool are very common now. Things are very cool still. But daddy-o, not so much now, right? But moreover, something else I should tell you is originally West Side Story, much like in the late 50s, space exploration was a fascination by a lot of people. And originally, it was going to be a sci-fi adventure, and Riff, the lead of the Jets, was speaking of exploring the moon and flying, and hence the Jets came into play. But they brought it back down to East and West Side in New York. But they kept a lot of the Space Commander terms and breaking the gang into troops and calling them Ace Man and Rocket Man. And it kept it really childlike and kept it really fun and inventive because they were essentially children that they were speaking of. So they wanted to concentrate on Riff's free-spiritedness, and the music he wrote for a song which did not make the show was called My Greatest Day. So instead they threw in the Jet song, which starts off the show. It took a better part of a month to work out the song, but when it was presented to Jerome Robbins, his reaction was to say that he could introduce the Jets and the Sharks better in dance. That is, set up the gang's feeling that the neighborhood was their territory alone. And they fought and fought and fought and wrote 4 different songs to open the show, West Side Story, and ultimately lost, and instead inspired a 14-minute long prologue, but through dance. And they had an incredible fusion of, here it again, dance, telling the story, creating these characters, yet the undercurrent of the music. It's a brilliant, brilliant prologue. It's active. It lets you know everything that's happening, who the characters are before the first word is even mentioned in the show. So Jerome Robbins did know what he was talking about in that instance. Another part of West Side that I found very fascinating and I learned in this book was that song America that Anita sings with all of the ladies. Originally written, Arthur Lawrence and Stephen Sondheim had that song written for both the men and the women of the Shark Gang. Bernardo and Anita were supposed to sing about Bernardo loving the United States, Anita wishing she was back in Puerto Rico. And so it was intended to be an argument between Bernardo and Anita, partly to enrich their relationship by adding some contention to it. And since Arthur Lawrence had no time in the libretto to explore it, he wanted to flesh out those two characters and that relationship a little bit more. And again, the social reflection on their take on America. And but Jerome Robbins insisted that the song be for just the girls. just the women of the Sharks, and it was the only chance in this production for a full blown out female dance number. So they created this character titled Rosalia, who was invented to take Bernardo's place. And when the movie idea and rights were being promoted, Stephen Sondheim and Arthur Lawrence fought for this idea again. And if you've ever seen the movie West Side Story, you'll notice that in the movie version, it is both a mixture of the men in the Shark Gang and the women singing America. But I found that to be very interesting because when we produced West Side Story 7 years ago, the gentleman who was choreographing and directing worked on the Jerome Robbins Broadway show, which was it was sort of a culmination of a lot of Jerome Robbins' work, titled Jerome Robbins Broadway, and he played the role of Bernardo, and he said, "I do know that choreography. There have been companies in the world that have had the rights to do that. Would you at Cohoes Musical be interested in that?" I was playing the character of Bernardo in that production. So I said, "Of course, more stage time? Yes." But I also, understand the relationship there, and I think it was truly telling a little bit more, fleshing out a little bit more of the relationship, and was really hoping that the Bernstein Foundation would allow us to do that. Unfortunately, they did not, and that's where royalties and licensing and all of that wonderful business behind the show business comes into play. But we did go as far as learning all of the choreography and exploring it. Unfortunately, we were never able to perform it, although it does work as a beautiful piece with just the women as well. Another production of Stephen Sondheim that you might be familiar with is Gypsy. Unlike West Side Story, Stephen Sondheim did acquire the confidence to use his talent without apology. He no longer felt that he had to imitate other writers or to follow instruction from collaborators, and his apprenticeship was over. He felt like an equal, not less because Gypsy was a musical whose characters were types familiar to him, whose diction he could imitate with natural ease, and whose backgrounds he could relate to. So before Rodgers and Hammerstein popularized musicals with compelling stories and people with at least two dimensions to them, the characters in Broadway shows hadn't been characters so much as collections of characteristics, the kinds who could be described with one adjective or one noun. The shy hero, the aggressive vamp, the wisecracking friend, the stodgy parent, and so on. So as consequence, the songs that they sang reflected only the outlook of the songwriters or the personalities of the performers. So they thought with Gypsy, he thought this is a way for me to really work on truly understanding what these characters can say, can do in a vernacular that he understood, in a vernacular he was a little bit more comfortable with. A challenge for him, and something I learned, were the lead-ins to songs are the trickiest things to get right in a musical, along with the buttons of the song, the way a song is wrapped up. The transitions are tough enough to accomplish in straight plays. Getting graceful from one thought to another within a speech or one tone to another, in a sense, often requires a lot of delicate sweat work, he calls it. Unlike novels, plays happily have handy tools known as actors, who can smooth out the bumps. With a song, however, performers are stuck with whatever the songwriter hands them. If the transition from speaking to singing is too abrupt, it will seem awkward. If over-prepared with underscoring, it will be predictable and boring. And I have to admit, it's been about 4 years that I started to really enjoy and like musical theater. kind of ridiculous to say considering this is my livelihood and I produce musical theater. But I've always had that, you hear the chord, the bell tone, bing, and then here comes this beautiful song. Predictable, right? And that seems like one of the things that always just jarred me in a musical theater. You have a gorgeous, seamless scene. All of a sudden, you hear the chord. Oh, I guess they're about to break out into song. Okay, here we go. And you put your seatbelt on and you watch the song, and I used to just, yearn for that time when they stopped singing and started speaking again. Stephen Sondheim found a way to make that seamless. It's incredible how delicate his entries are into his songs, and how fluid the buttons or the finality of his songs are. I see that in Gypsy. I see that in Into the Woods. Anyone Can Whistle, or beautiful transitions. So it works really glorious. But what he did was he focused on making it seamless for the actor, smooth for the director, and ease for the audience. So it was never jarring. Another part of Gypsy, which I found to be interesting, again, another Jerome Robbins collaboration. Jerome Robbins wanted Gypsy to encompass all of vaudeville. And to this end, Jerome Robbins auditioned dog acts, jugglers, whistlers, double-jointed acrobats, and everything possible to use between the book scenes. And when I researched a little bit more about Gypsy, there truly were all these added scenes. And one scene between Gypsy and Mama Rose, they were under a tightrope, and there were trapeze artists walking over them. That would be so distracting as an audience member. Who are you watching? The two lead characters, or hoping that the trapeze artist doesn't fall on them? But that was Jerome Robbins. So in the face of Arthur Lawrence's fierce and righteous objections, the plan was sculpted. But in exploring its possibilities along the way, Jerome Robbins and he had discussed that the first vaudevillian number should be about, and he whined to him that the hardest kind of lyric to come up with was a lyric with no specific situation, the kind which has so many possibilities that there is no basis for choosing one. So he glared at him, Jerome Robbins glared at Stephen Sondheim impatiently and said, "Just say what it is." And he said, "Like what?" He said, "I don't know, something along the lines of, let's entertain you." Okay? He said, "Would you like me to say, let me entertain us?" Well, we should talk about us or you. Who are we entertaining? So this bickering went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and it turned out to be sort of the swan song of that production, opening with Baby June and Louise singing "Let Us Entertain You," and then the same song that Louise, coming of age, also sang "Let Me Entertain You." There's another I was really interested to hear about Ethel Merman and learning more about her. Here he speaks about, it took him a week of sporadic thinking and jolting to come up with a title for the song, a phrase that could serve as a refrain. Oh, we'll get back to Ethel Merman in just a second, but I have to tell you about this. The difficulty was to find a way to say, things are going to be better than ever, without being flatly colloquial on the one hand, or fanciful and imaginative, like a West Side Story on the other hand. So he was proud of the solution, and especially so when he picked up the New York Times one morning in 1968 and read the first sentence in the leading editorial: "Everything's not coming up roses in Vietnam." So I had no idea. I thought that "everything's coming up roses" was one of those slang terms that everyone kind of said, and no, Stephen Sondheim wrote "everything's coming up roses." looking into more Ethel Merman. Where's that story? I can't find it, but I do remember. There's an actor by the name of Jerry Orbach who was in the production of Gypsy. And Ethel Merman was, obviously we understand her incredible voice and confidence on stage and brass. Wasn't really touted as a very talented performer. What you saw in her performance was exactly the same thing you saw in rehearsal, was exactly the same thing you saw years and years and years before. So at least she was very consistent in what I understand. And there aren't many people who can sing over a 25-piece orchestra in a 2,000-seat theater without microphones, which is exactly what she did. But one incident in this book that I read about was she was in the middle of a scene, and after the performance, and she seemed a little agitated on stage that day in that scene. And after the performance, she called her producer, stage manager, and her agent into the room with this actor, Jerry Orbach, and asked him questions and said, in my scene, I saw that you were doing something, and it was a little distracting. And he goes, Ms. Merman, I don't understand what you're talking about. I wasn't doing anything. I was, just there. And she goes, no, you were doing something. You were looking at me, and I can tell that you were thinking about something, and it was incredibly distracting to me. And he goes, again, I don't quite understand what you were talking about. I was listening and performing. She goes, well, please don't ever do that again. So Miss Merman had her ways. My friend here, Bill, is in an upcoming production of Anyone Can Whistle. When is that? When is it?
It's the not so common players late May, late April.
Oh, late April. Okay, great.
We're just starting.
In late April, with the Not So Common Players in Clifton Park, correct? Anyone Can Whistle. So I read a funny anecdote here that I kind of wanted to bring up, since you, if you don't know the production Anyone Can Whistle, the notion is it's a fanciful story of a small, economically depressed American town whose new mayoress gets the bright idea of arranging a fake miracle to attract tourists. The tourists arrive, but they become intermixed with the inmates of the local cookie jar, a rest home for nonconformists. So it's a farcical tale, as you can tell. So this was another collaboration between Arthur Lawrence and Stephen Sondheim, and they both shared a fondness for whimsy and attempted at a social political satire in a freewheeling form. It might generously be considered one of the first absurdist musicals, and it certainly did inhabit both the strengths and the dangers of the genre, imagination, and cleverness, which too often, instead of enriching each other, draw attention to themselves. Stephen Sondheim once found himself on an airplane sitting next to a playwright, Peter Shaffer, a man he'd only met briefly, and was startled and delighted to hear him speak enthusiastically about being among the very few who had seen the original production of Anyone Can Whistle, which only ran for 13 performances. As Peter Shaffer mentioned, it was among the most brilliant and original theater pieces I've ever been to. And as he was saying that, Stephen Sondheim started to feel very preen. And he concluded, Peter Shaffer, by saying, as well as one of the most irritating. So he singled out that at the end of the first act, with its condescension toward the audience as helping to explain the hostility of both press and public, and Stephen Sondheim does admit that he was right. He and Arthur Lawrence had written the piece as if they were the two smartest kids in the back of the class, wittily making fun of the teacher as well as fellow students, demonstrating how far ahead of the established wisdom they were. But the show did suffer a number of indignities during its pre-Broadway tour in Philadelphia. Among them was a heart attack of their lead player, Henry Lascow, followed by 2 days later, one of the dancers falling into the orchestra pit. And this caused a concussion of the string player that he fell on, who then was hospitalized and then within the next week died. So Angela Lansbury was also a part of that production and was very close to quitting and found herself to be completely unhappy and on stage and completely insecure in her performance. But after the lead actor, Henry Lascow, left and the understudy stepped in, Angela Lansbury's performance began to blossom. And so it wasn't so much her own insecurities, but the way that this other actor was making her feel and feeling insecure. So the show sort of blossomed. And that's sort of the way of theater. I think things happen for a reason. I find, again, I've really scratched the surface with this book here. Stephen Sondheim has he's offered and brought so much to the world of theater, especially in really inspiring younger composers, younger lyricists, and letting them know that it doesn't have to be so square. We can really think outside of the box. Math equations don't really have to make a lot of sense in musical theater. He also believed that it does happen for a reason, and that's why going back into his first principles is that it's in the hands of God, and it's all for the sake of that his content always dictates form, less is more, and God is in the details. And so if he follows those principles, his shows become clear, the audience's interpretation of his performances become very clear, and his collaborators understand exactly where he is channeling his creative juices from. So I really urge and welcome any of you to see some of Stephen Sondheim's work, to read his work, but I think more importantly, listen to it. Listen to the lyrics. Listen to the underscoring of his music. And as a director, as a performer, knowing that Arthur Lawrence, here's one last tale. Arthur Lawrence and he were working on Gypsy, and he wasn't quite sure why Ethel Merman and some other actors weren't understanding exactly where he was coming from with a certain song or a piece. And they went down to the actor studio where this man by the name of Stanislavski was teaching, and they sat there for 6 hours watching an actor prepare for a scene, an actor execute the scene. And it was through then that he understood how important it is to help the actors out and to clarify as much as he possibly can. So Stephen Sondheim developed what he calls a roadmap for the actor, a roadmap for the director. He sees every line, every word that he writes from the point of view of a performer, and then to aid and help the director as well. So not much subtext has to be thought of, not much of backstory has to be developed. If you listen to the words, if you listen to the music, that's exactly what the playwright intended, and the lyricist intended, and the composer did. And that's why I think his pieces will last and have been revived many, many, many times. The latest one with A Little Night Music, again with Angela Lansbury and Catherine Zeta-Jones and Bernadette Peters and Elaine Stritch. There's a whole Stephen Sondheim Society. He has his own performing arts center in Iowa. In London, his shows, there have been years and years where there's always a Stephen Sondheim performance production on in the West End playing. So I urge you to look more into Stephen Sondheim whenever you see a piece of his. Anyone Can Whistle and Into the Woods, opening February 3rd at the Cohoes Music Hall. Stop by and see it. And then our young group is doing that. And it's incredibly awe-inspiring that, one, people can understand his music, can remember his music, and know when to sing, because the timing is so unique. But his timing in American musical theater was perfect for what we needed at that time. Thank you for listening.